The icy wind howled through the barren landscape as snowflakes swirled like ghostly whispers. In the middle of this frozen wasteland, a lone Mustang horse stood, its once mighty frame now frail and trembling. Its breath came in ragged clouds, eyes filled with desperation. Abandoned, sick, helpless, with every ounce of strength left in its weary body, the horse lowered its head, not in surrender, but in a silent plea. Would mercy come before the cold claimed its life? The Mustang barely felt its own hooves pressing into the frozen ground. The snow had buried most of the landscape in a thick, merciless sheet of white, stretching endlessly in all directions. The wind howled through the empty wilderness, carrying sharp blades of ice that cut into its skin. Each breath was shallow, labored, forming weak clouds of mist that vanished into the storm. It could barely keep its eyes open, frost clinging to its lashes, vision blurred by exhaustion. It had been abandoned, left behind, forgotten in the middle of this frozen wasteland. The Mustang's body was failing. Its once powerful muscles had wasted away. The strength that had carried it across endless plains now reduced to trembling limbs barely able to support its weight. Hunger gnawed at its insides, but there was nothing left to eat, no grass, no shelter, nothing but the unforgiving winter stretching for miles in every direction. It had tried to follow the herd, pushing forward despite the sickness that weighed on its body like an invisible chain. But the others had moved too fast, their instincts driving them towards safety, leaving behind the weakest among them. The Mustang had called out desperate, its cries swallowed by the relentless wind. No one had turned back. Now, it stood alone, legs shaking, frost clinging to its coat like a cruel reminder that time was running out. The storm was growing worse. Snow piled higher around its hooves, burying the world inch by inch, erasing everything beneath an endless, suffocating white. It took a step forward. Its knee buckled, sending it crashing onto the frozen ground. The impact sent a jolt of pain up its legs, but it barely reacted. The energy to even flinch was slipping away. The night was coming. The Mustang had spent enough winters in the wild to know what that meant. When the sun disappeared, the real cold would set in, the kind that turned breath into ice and stole the life from anything too weak to fight. It would not survive the night. It should have been afraid. It should have fought harder. Instead, it lowered its head, pressing its muzzle against the frozen ground, too exhausted to move. The cold was no longer something it feared. It was something it could feel creeping into its bones, stealing the last remnants of warmth from its body. This was how it would end. The thoughts settled deep in its mind, quiet and heavy. No herd, no home, just the snow, the wind, and the fading beat of its own heart. But then something changed. Through the thick curtain of falling snow, a flicker of light broke through the darkness. A tiny glow, distant and small, barely visible in the storm. The Mustang blinked, weak and unfocused, unsure if it was real or just a trick of the fading light. The glow moved. A figure emerged from the storm, wrapped in thick layers of fabric, pushing forward against the wind. Their steps were slow, careful, each one crunching through the snow as they made their way toward the Mustang. The light they carried flickered against the storm, barely holding its own against the howling wind, but it didn't go out. The Mustang lifted its head, just slightly, ears twitching as the figure drew closer. It had seen humans before, in the distance, watching them from the safety of the wild. Some had been hunters, others travelers, never staying long, never approaching. This one was different. They stopped just a few feet away, standing still, staring at the sight before them. The Mustang knew what they saw, a dying horse, ribs jutting out beneath a thick coat of ice-covered fur, legs too weak to stand, a breath away from collapsing completely. The figure hesitated, their grip tightening around the lantern, uncertain. A wild horse was dangerous, even in its weakest state. It was still a creature of instinct, unpredictable, capable of lashing out if it felt threatened. The Mustang did nothing. It didn't have the strength to fight. Instead, it looked up, eyes locking onto the stranger's gaze. There was no wild defiance left in them, no fear, no anger. Only exhaustion, only a quiet, desperate plea. "Help me." The traveler exhaled, their breath forming a misty cloud in the freezing air. Then, slowly, they took a step forward. The Mustang flinched, just barely, but didn't pull away. The traveler knelt, placing the lantern down in the snow, the glow casting a faint, golden circle of light between them. Reaching into their thick coat, they pulled out a wool blanket, shaking off the snow that clung to its edges before carefully draping it over the Mustang's back. The warmth was faint, but the Mustang felt it instantly. The traveler moved carefully, deliberately, avoiding sudden movements that might startle the exhausted animal. Their hands were rough, callous from years of hardship, but their touch was steady, gentle. For the first time in what felt like forever, the Mustang felt something other than the biting cold. It felt warmth. It wasn't much. It wasn't enough, but it was something. The traveler stayed for a moment, watching, as if waiting to see if the Mustang would react, if it would accept the fragile lifeline being offered. The Mustang did not move. It could not, but it didn't resist either. The traveler exhaled again, shaking their head, muttering something under their breath, something soft, almost apologetic. Then, without hesitation, they stepped forward and pressed a firm, steady hand against the Mustang's neck. "You're not dying here," they whispered. The words meant nothing to the horse, but the feeling behind them did. The Mustang took a breath. Then, with everything it had left, it pushed against the ground and tried to stand. The Mustang's legs trembled as it struggled to push itself up from the snow. The blanket draped over its back offered little warmth, but the weight of it, the presence of something other than ice and wind, gave it a sliver of strength. The traveler's hand remained firm against its neck, steady, unwavering, as if they understood the fragile balance between life and collapse. For a moment, it seemed impossible. The Mustang's body was weak, drained of all energy, its muscles aching from the cold. Every attempt to rise sent another wave of exhaustion crashing over it. The traveler could see it, how close the animal was to surrendering completely. "Come on," the traveler murmured, barely audible over the wind. They moved carefully, shifting their stance, pressing their shoulder gently against the Mustang's side. A silent encouragement, a promise that it wasn't alone. The Mustang tried again. Its hooves scraped against the frozen ground, struggling for purchase. The weight of the snow pressing down on its limbs made every movement feel heavier than it should have been. Its breathing was ragged, each exhale forming misty clouds that vanished too quickly in the storm. Then, with a final desperate push, it found its footing. The Mustang wobbled unsteadily, its legs barely holding its weight, but it was up, standing, however unsteady, was better than lying in the snow, waiting for the cold to steal the last of its life. The traveler stepped back slightly, watching, making sure the horse wouldn't collapse again. The Mustang's body trembled violently, but it remained upright, nostrils flaring as it took in the scent of the humans standing beside it. There was no herd scent on them, no familiar smell of wild grass or open plains, just leather, wool, and something earthy beneath it all. The storm raged on around them, snow falling thick and heavy, the wind relentless. If they stayed here much longer, the Mustang wouldn't make it through the night. The traveler knew that. They reached out again slowly, placing their hand against the Mustang's side, feeling the shivering muscles beneath its skin. It needed warmth, it needed food, and it needed to get out of the storm before the cold claimed it completely. The traveler turned slightly, glancing back in the direction they had come from. The path was nearly buried now, the storm working quickly to erase their footprints. The cabin wasn't far, maybe a mile, 2 at most, but in these conditions, it might as well have been a lifetime away. They hesitated for only a second before making their decision. Carefully, they moved to the Mustang's side, gripping the edge of the wool blanket and pulling it tighter over the horse's back. Then they placed a firm hand on its shoulder and took a step forward. The Mustang didn't move. It stood still, ears twitching slightly, its body locked in place. The instinct to run, to retreat, was still somewhere inside it, buried beneath layers of exhaustion and frostbite, but it didn't resist. "Come on," the traveler tried again, voice steady but gentle. The Mustang's ears flicked at the sound, and this time it moved. A single step, then another. Each movement was slow, unsteady, but it was movement nonetheless. The traveler walked beside it, not pulling, not forcing, just guiding, letting the Mustang decide whether it would follow. And it did. Step by step, through the blinding snow, they moved together. The wind fought them, the cold trying to sink its claws deeper into the Mustang's skin. But the horse pressed forward. It wasn't moving fast, and every step felt heavier than the last, but it wasn't stopping. The traveler glanced over at it, watching the way it held its head low, its body still trembling, yet pushing forward despite it all. "You're a fighter," they muttered under their breath. The storm thickened around them, making it nearly impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. The traveler tightened their grip on the lantern, keeping it close, its weak glow the only thing cutting through the endless white. The Mustang walked beside them, never straying too far, though its legs threatened to give out more than once. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The traveler's fingers had long since gone numb, and the Mustang's steps were growing more labored with every passing moment. Then, finally, a break in the storm. Through the thick curtain of snow, a faint outline emerged. A structure, small, barely more than a shadow against the storm, but unmistakably there. Relief surged through the traveler's chest, but they didn't let themselves celebrate just yet. They weren't there. Not yet. With renewed determination, they moved forward, urging the Mustang along. The horse's breathing was harsh, nostrils flaring, every part of it screaming with exhaustion, but it kept walking, step by step, until at last they reached the cabin. The traveler barely paused before pushing open the door, leading the Mustang inside the small wooden barn attached to the cabin. The air inside was still cold, but compared to the raging storm outside, it was a world of difference. The Mustang stood there, sides heaving, its body still shivering violently from the cold, but for the first time in hours, maybe days, it wasn't alone in the storm. It was safe. For now. The Mustang stood in the dimly lit barn, its breath coming in slow, uneven bursts. The warmth inside was faint, barely enough to ease the frozen grip that had taken hold of his body, but it was better than the merciless storm outside. Snow still clung to its thick coat, melting in small droplets that ran down its sides, soaking into the thin layer of hay beneath its hooves. The wind outside howled against the wooden walls, but in here, it was quieter. The traveler moved quickly, pulling off their gloves and rubbing their hands together, trying to bring feeling back into their fingers. Their eyes stayed on the Mustang, watching the way it trembled, its legs threatening to give out at any moment. It wouldn't last long like this. They turned and reached for an old blanket tucked away in the corner, shaking off the dust before stepping closer to the Mustang. The horse tensed slightly, nostrils flaring, but it was too weak to react beyond that. The traveler draped the blanket over its back, pressing it down gently to trap as much warmth as possible. "Easy," they murmured, voice soft, barely above a whisper. The Mustang shifted slightly, adjusting to the unfamiliar weight. It wasn't enough. The traveler moved to the small storage area at the back of the barn, rummaging through old supplies. There had to be something, anything, that could help. A bag of oats, some leftover hay, even stale bread would be better than nothing. After a few moments, they found a small pile of dried grass. Not fresh, but edible. It would have to do. Bringing the hay forward, they placed it carefully in front of the Mustang, stepping back to give it space. The horse hesitated, its tired eyes flicking toward the food, uncertain. Hunger gnawed at its insides, but exhaustion made even the simplest movement feel impossible. For a moment, the traveler thought it might not eat. Then, slowly, The Mustang lowered its head, lips brushing against the dried strands. It took a bite, chewing sluggishly, as if even that required more energy than it had to give. But it was eating. That was something. The traveler exhaled, stepping back, watching as the horse continued to take slow, careful bites. They leaned against the wooden railing, letting their own exhaustion settle over them. The journey had been harder than they expected. Outside, the wind battered the barn relentlessly, trying to force its way through the cracks in the wood. Snow piled higher against the walls, sealing them inside, but in this moment, none of that mattered. What mattered was a horse standing before them, still alive despite the odds stacked against it. Minutes passed in silence, broken only by the quiet sound of chewing. The Mustang's body was still trembling, but the violent shivers had lessened, the blanket and food providing just enough warmth to keep it from slipping further toward the edge. The traveler pushed off the railing and moved toward a small wooden shelf, searching for anything that might help speed up the Mustang's recovery. A lantern flickered in the corner, casting weak, golden light across the walls, stretching their shadows long and thin. They found an old tin cup and poured a small amount of water into it, setting it near the hay. The Mustang's ears twitched, acknowledging the movement, but it made no immediate attempt to drink. The traveler sighed, rubbing a hand over their face, exhaustion weighing on them heavily. They hadn't planned for this. Finding a half-dead Mustang in the middle of a blizzard wasn't something they had expected when they set out earlier that day. But now that they were here, they couldn't ignore the responsibility that had fallen into their hands. The Mustang shifted slightly, lifting its head for the first time since they had arrived. Its dark eyes met the travelers, filled with something unreadable, wary but not fearful. It was a strange moment, quiet and heavy, stretched between them like an unspoken understanding. "You're stubborn," the traveler muttered, "but you made it." The horse blinked slowly, nostrils flaring as it exhaled a deep, tired breath. The traveler wasn't sure how long they stood there, watching each other, but eventually, the Mustang lowered its head again, this time not from weakness, but from something else. Trust, or something close to it. The traveler exhaled, rolling their shoulders before taking a step back. There was nothing more they could do for now except wait. Wait, and hope that the Mustang had enough fight left in it to make it through the night. The storm outside raged on, snow hammering against the roof, wind screaming through the cracks. But inside this small, fragile shelter, the battle was already being fought. And the Mustang wasn't giving up just yet. The Mustang stood in the dim light, its breathing steadier now, though fatigue still clung to its every movement. The blanket draped over its back was damp from melted snow, but it provided just enough warmth to keep the worst of the cold at bay. The traveler remained nearby, leaning against a wooden post, their own exhaustion beginning to take hold. They hadn't expected to spend the night tending to a half-frozen horse. Yet here they were, watching over the fragile life they had stumbled upon in the storm. Outside, the wind continued to howl, rattling the wooden structure as if testing its strength. Snow piled against the walls, sealing them further inside. But for now, none of that mattered. The storm would pass. It always did. The real concern lay with the Mustang, whose body had been pushed beyond its limits. It had survived the journey, but whether it would last the night was another question entirely. The travelers shifted, reaching for a small bundle near their feet. They unwrapped a strip of dried meat and took a slow bite, chewing without much thought. Their gaze never left the Mustang, watching for any signs of worsening. The horse had stopped shaking as violently, and though its movements were sluggish, it continued to eat, pulling at the last strands of hay with weak determination. That was a good sign. It meant there was still strength left in it, however little. Minutes stretched into an hour, then 2. The barn remained silent except for the occasional crackle of wind seeping through the wooden beams. The Mustang lowered its head, eyes half-lidded, its exhaustion finally overcoming the hunger that had kept it awake. The traveler hesitated before stepping forward, moving slowly to avoid startling it. With careful hands, they adjusted the blanket, tucking it more securely around the Mustang's body. The horse flicked an ear but didn't move away, accepting the small gesture without resistance. A quiet understanding settled between them, unspoken yet unmistakable. This creature had been alone, left to face the merciless cold without help. It had fought to survive, and now, for the first time in what was likely days, it wasn't alone. The travelers sat down on a bale of hay, stretching out their legs with a tired sigh. Their own body ached from the journey, their fingers stiff from the lingering cold. They rubbed their hands together, trying to bring warmth back into them, before resting their arms on their knees. The Mustang remained standing but shifted slightly, pressing its weight against the wooden post beside it. They watched each other in silence. The hours passed slowly, the storm outside gradually losing its strength. The wind, once howling with fury, had softened into a distant whisper, the snow no longer falling as heavily against the roof. Morning would come soon, bringing light back to the frozen landscape. The worst had passed. The traveler let out a slow breath, their shoulders easing for the first time that night. They hadn't planned for this, hadn't expected to be sitting in a barn, watching over a Mustang that had been left for dead. But now, looking at the horse standing before them, they couldn't imagine having left it behind. The Mustang shifted, lifting its head slightly, nostrils flaring as it took in the air. Its legs were still weak, but there was something different in its posture now. Less desperation, more resolve. It was still recovering, still fragile, but it was no longer on the edge of collapse. The traveler leaned forward, resting their elbows on their knees. "You're going to make it," they murmured. The horse didn't react at first. Then, slowly it blinked, its ears twitching toward the sound of the voice. The connection between them was fragile, built in the space of a single night, but it was real. The Mustang had fought to survive, and the traveler had given it a chance. In another time, another place, they might have passed each other without a second thought. But fate had brought them together in the middle of a snowstorm, and now neither of them would walk away unchanged. As the first rays of morning light began to creep through the cracks in the barn, the traveler pushed themselves to their feet, stretching out their stiff limbs. The Mustang watched, its dark eyes following the movement. The worst of the night was over, and with it, the promise of something new. A second chance. For both of them. The first light of dawn crept into the barn, soft and golden, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. The traveler rubbed their tired eyes, muscles stiff from the long night, spent watching over the Mustang. The storm had passed, leaving behind a thick silence, broken only by the occasional shift of snow outside. The Mustang stood still, its breath forming gentle clouds in the crisp morning air. The violent shivers had lessened, its legs steadier beneath its weight. It was not yet strong, not yet fully recovered, but it was standing without struggle. That alone was a victory. The traveler stepped closer, careful not to move too quickly. The Mustang watched but did not retreat. Its dark eyes, once filled with exhaustion and fear, now held something different. Not quite trust, but not resistance either. A quiet acknowledgement that the night had changed something between them. Kneeling beside the small pile of remaining hay, the traveler picked up a handful and extended it toward the Mustang. The horse hesitated, nostrils flaring, before leaning in and taking the offering gently from their palm. The warmth of its breath brushed against their skin, a fleeting sensation, but it lingered longer than it should have. "You made it," the traveler murmured, voice barely more than a whisper. The Mustang chewed slowly, its gaze never leaving them. There was a time, not long ago, when it would have turned away, when instinct would have sent it fleeing into the wild, never looking back. But something had shifted. The storm had forced them together, binding them in a way neither had planned. Now, standing in the fragile stillness of morning, the question remained, what came next? The traveler exhaled, looking toward the barn doors, the edges lined with frost where the night's cold had seeped through. Beyond them, The world was waking beneath the weight of fresh snow. The storm had buried the landscape, smoothing the jagged edges of rocks and fallen branches, turning everything into an endless expanse of white. Somewhere out there, the Mustang's herd had moved on, pushing toward warmth, leaving behind the one too weak to keep up. But it had survived. The traveler knew they couldn't keep the Mustang. It wasn't theirs to hold on to. Wild horses belonged to the open plains, not the confined space of wooden walls and narrow pastures. Yet the thought of watching it walk away left an unexpected tightness in their chest. They reached out again, this time not offering food, just the lightest touch against the Mustang's neck. The horse didn't flinch, didn't pull away. It stood firm, allowing the moment to pass between them. "You're strong," the traveler said. "You always were." The barn door creaked as they pushed it open, the cold rushing in to meet them. The Mustang's ears flicked forward, head lifting as it took in the sight of the snow-covered world waiting beyond. The sky stretched wide, pale blue with streaks of gold where the sun had begun its slow rise. The traveler stepped back, giving the Mustang space, waiting. For a long moment, the horse didn't move. It stared out at the horizon, muscles tense, as if uncertain whether to step forward. The wind picked up slightly, carrying the distant scent of trees and open fields, a reminder of what lay beyond this shelter. Then, with a deep breath, the Mustang took its first step. The traveler watched as it moved forward, slow at first, unsteady, but gaining strength with each stride. Snow crunched beneath its hooves, leaving a clear path behind it. And then, just as it reached the edge of the barn's shadow, the Mustang stopped. It turned its head slightly, just enough to look back. The traveler met its gaze, understanding passing between them in a way that needed no words. A silent goodbye, a quiet gratitude. Then, with a final flick of its tail, the Mustang turned and walked into the open, disappearing into the endless white. The traveler stood in the doorway for a long time, watching the spot where the horse had vanished. The wind carried away the last traces of its presence, erasing its footprints from the snow. And yet, somehow, they knew the Mustang would never be truly gone.